Hey there, I'm Mac the Storyteller, here to guide you tonight. Before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you from, and what time is it? Now, get comfortable, relax, and let the story take you away. Sam Thompson had been on the road for hours, and the dull hum of the highway had begun to seep into his bones. The endless stretch of asphalt was starting to make him feel like he'd been driving forever, so when he saw the sign for Linton, a small town nestled somewhere off the main route, he figured he'd stop for a bit. He'd never heard of Linton before. It wasn't on any of the bigger maps. Just one of those towns that barely made it past a dot on the page. The kind of place a traveler might pass through and forget about the next day. But something about it caught his attention. The sun was dipping low when Sam's car rolled into the town limits. The first thing he noticed was the silence. The streets were empty, and the houses along the road seemed lifeless, their windows dark. There wasn't the usual buzz of activity you'd expect to see in a place like this. No cars parked along the sidewalks, no kids running through the yards. Nothing. He slowed the car, his gaze flicking from one side of the street to the other. The fog had begun to roll in, thick and white, almost like it had been waiting for him. It hung around the telephone poles and wrapped itself around the streetlights, the light from their old bulbs barely cutting through it. Sam parked the car near the town's main street, where a few people shuffled past, moving quickly, their heads down. No one made eye contact. Not a single person looked at him directly. He felt his unease grow, but he told himself it was nothing. Maybe they were just busy. Maybe it was a quiet town. He decided to head toward the diner at the corner of the street. The bell above the door jingled softly as he stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and something else, something metallic. The diner was nearly empty. A couple sat in the far corner, not talking, not even looking at each other. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with a tired face, stood behind the counter, her hands wringing a dishcloth. Sam sat at the counter, trying not to stare at the couple. He ordered a coffee, but when the waitress didn't answer, he cleared his throat and said it again, this time louder. "Coffee, please." The waitress looked up, her expression blank, and nodded slowly. She didn't speak. Sam shifted uncomfortably. He glanced over at the couple again, but they were still, unmoving, their eyes fixed on nothing in particular. He couldn't figure out why, but he felt like an intruder. The waitress returned with his coffee. She set it down in front of him without a word and walked away. Sam took a sip. It was cold. He tried again. What's going on here? It's so quiet, like no one lives here. The waitress didn't respond. Her eyes flicked to the couple for a moment, then back to Sam, but she still didn't say anything. There was something about her eyes, something wary, like she was watching him, waiting for him to leave. Sam could feel the tension in the air, thick like a fog. He took another sip of coffee, his mind racing with questions. He wanted to know more about this place. A man entered the diner, his face drawn and pale, and without looking at Sam, he sat down at the counter. He wasn't old, maybe in his 40s, but his eyes were sunken, tired. He didn't greet anyone, didn't acknowledge Sam's presence. The man stared straight ahead, his hands resting stiffly on the counter, palms down. The waitress set a glass of water in front of him, but again, she didn't speak. The man didn't take a sip. His gaze stayed fixed on the counter, not moving. It was as though he was lost in his own thoughts, but Sam couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He looked around, trying to meet someone's gaze, but no one would look at him. Not the waitress, not the man, not the couple in the corner. It was as if he didn't exist. Finally, Sam stood up, feeling a growing sense of discomfort. He needed to get some answers, but no one was giving him anything. He walked out of the diner, the bell jingling as the door swung shut behind him. The street outside was just as empty as before, but now it felt darker, colder. The fog had thickened, and the air was damp against his skin. He looked around again, but this time he caught sight of something that made his heart skip a beat. A figure standing in the distance, near the end of the street, half hidden in the fog. The figure didn't move, didn't seem to acknowledge him. But Sam could feel it watching him with a kind of stillness that made the hairs on his neck rise. He glanced back toward the diner, his hand on the door. The waitress was still inside, standing motionless at the counter. She hadn't moved. Sam swallowed hard, his stomach tight. There was something very wrong about this place. Something that didn't belong. He turned and walked back toward his car, but as he moved, he noticed that the people he had seen earlier were now gathered in the streets, standing perfectly still, watching him. Not a single one of them spoke. It was as if the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for him to leave, or for him to make a mistake. The bell above the diner door jingled again, and Sam stepped inside, the warmth of the place feeling like a false comfort against the weight of the eerie quiet that clung to the streets outside. He hadn't meant to come back, but something had drawn him to the diner once more. It wasn't hunger. He wasn't even sure what it was. Curiosity, maybe, or something deeper. Something that gnawed at him, pulling him toward the heart of the town where the questions he had might finally find their answers. The couple was gone, and the man who had sat next to Sam earlier had disappeared, too. The waitress was still there, but this time she wasn't alone. An elderly woman, bent with age and frailty, sat in one of the booths near the window. Her hands were folded in front of her, but she looked up as Sam walked in, her eyes sharp despite her age. There was something about her, a quiet intensity, like she knew things she couldn't say. Sam felt his gaze drawn to her, as though her presence could pull the answers he sought right out of the fog that surrounded him. He made his way to the counter, avoiding her eyes for now, but he could feel her watching him. Sam sat down on the stool, ordered a coffee, and tried to ignore the creeping discomfort that curled in his chest. He took a sip of the bitter brew, but he didn't really taste it. His mind was on the silence, the suffocating silence that had settled over the entire town. He couldn't help himself. His eyes drifted back to the elderly woman. She was still watching him, her gaze unwavering. He saw the subtle movement before he heard the sound. The elderly woman's lips parted, as if she was about to speak. Sam's heart skipped. Finally, a word. Maybe this was it. Maybe she would tell him what was really going on in Linton. But before she could make a sound, a young man entered the diner. He looked to be in his 30s, with a rough-hewn face and hands that were visibly worn from hard labor. His eyes, sharp and nervous, flicked to the elderly woman as soon as he entered. Sam saw the instant recognition in the man's face, a flash of something like panic. Without a word, he strode over to the elderly woman's booth, and before Sam could fully process what was happening, the younger man reached out, his hand hovering near the woman's mouth. She was still trying to speak, her lips trembling as if the words were there, trapped behind them. The man made a gesture, a frantic wave of his hand in front of her face, and Sam saw the fear in his eyes. "No," the man mouthed, his voice low but his intent clear. The elderly woman froze, her face tightening in a mix of confusion and frustration, and then, like something had snapped in her, she fell silent. Her mouth closed, and she lowered her gaze to her hands, as if the words she had tried to speak had never existed. The man stood there for a moment, his hands still raised, watching her carefully. Then he turned and made his way to the counter, his eyes briefly meeting Sam's. There was a moment of stillness, a silent understanding, or was it a warning? Sam couldn't tell. The man sat down a few stools down from Sam, ordering something quietly from the waitress. Sam was unsure whether to ask him what had just happened, whether to ask about the elderly woman. But the words stuck in his throat, caught on the same fear that seemed to pervade the air in the diner. The waitress, as silent as ever, delivered the man's order without a word. Sam stared at her for a long moment, trying to read something, anything, from her expression. But there was nothing. She was a shadow behind the counter, and she kept her eyes fixed on her work, as if Sam didn't exist. His mind was racing now, his thoughts swirling like the fog outside. The elderly woman had tried to speak. She had tried to break the silence, and whatever had been in her voice had been immediately stopped by the younger man. But why? Why couldn't anyone in Linton speak? What was so terrible about words? Sam took another sip of his coffee, but it was no use. The questions pressed harder now, and the need for answers gnawed at him. He couldn't stay here, not like this. He had to know more. He had to find out what happened to these people, why they had become nothing more than silent figures moving through their days. The man sitting a few stools down seemed to sense Sam's thoughts. He glanced up briefly, his eyes narrowing as if he could read the uncertainty in Sam's gaze. But he didn't say anything, didn't move. He only stared at Sam for a moment, and then he turned his attention back to his coffee, as if nothing had happened. Finally, Sam couldn't take it any more. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The sound was too loud in the stillness of the diner. He walked quickly toward the door, his mind set on finding answers. Before he could reach the door, he heard the elderly woman's voice, thin and weak but still there, like a fragile whisper. It was just a breath, but Sam caught it, his heart racing. "Generations," she rasped, her voice barely a murmur. "They've been mute for generations." The words hung in the air, and Sam froze in place, his hand on the door handle. There was more to it, he was sure of it. The people of Linton hadn't always been this way. There was a history, a curse perhaps, one that had been passed down through the years. He turned slowly, but the elderly woman had fallen silent once more, her hands folded tightly in front of her. The young man's eyes flicked up to meet Sam's again, and this time there was no mistaking the fear in them. This was no coincidence. This town, its people, their silence, it was all tied together by something far darker than Sam had imagined. Sam stepped back into the street, the cold air hitting his face. His breath came in short bursts, and he felt a sense of urgency that he hadn't felt before. Linton had a history, and he needed to uncover it, before it was too late. The inn was a crumbling relic of better days, its wooden floors groaning under each step Sam took as he made his way up the narrow staircase. The air smelled faintly of mildew, and the faint light from the flickering bulb above did little to mask the dust that clung to the corners of the walls. Sam had no intention of staying here longer than he had to, but the town's only other options were either too far or too run down. Linton wasn't exactly a bustling tourist destination. His room was small, barely more than a bed and a rickety dresser. The window was cracked, and the wind outside howled through the gaps in the frame, adding a mournful soundtrack to the silence that still gripped the town. It felt like a tomb, a place where words had been swallowed whole and locked away, never to see the light of day. Sam tossed his bag onto the bed and sat on the edge, staring out the window. The street below was empty, not a single soul in sight. The fog had thickened since the evening, swirling like smoke in the night air. He couldn't shake the feeling that the town was watching him, waiting for something, or perhaps waiting for him to leave. He lay back on the bed, the old mattress creaking beneath him, but sleep didn't come easily. His mind kept racing, circling back to the same questions. Why couldn't the people of Linton speak? What was the curse? And most importantly, what had happened to the town that made it so empty? Just as his eyelids began to droop, a faint noise drifted through the thin walls. Voices. They were muffled, barely audible, but Sam froze at the sound. He got up and crept toward the door, pressing his ear against it. The voices came from downstairs, low and urgent, like a whispered conversation. He couldn't make out the words, but he could tell the speakers were trying to be discreet, as though they didn't want anyone to hear. Curiosity won out over caution, and Sam quietly opened the door. He stepped into the hallway, moving carefully to avoid the creaky floorboards that had plagued him since he arrived. He reached the top of the stairs and crouched down, peering around the banister. Below, in the dimly lit lobby, two men sat at a table, their heads leaning close together. One of them had a thick, weathered face, like a man who had seen too much, while the other appeared younger, with sharp eyes that flicked nervously toward the door every so often. Sam couldn't make out their words clearly, but one of them spoke with a kind of low urgency, his voice edged with fear. They can't say it," the younger man said, his voice trembling. "It's been like this for generations, hasn't it? They can't speak, because of what happens when they do." The older man glanced around, his face tight, as if he feared someone might hear. "You don't understand," he muttered, leaning closer to the younger man. "The creatures, they're not just stories. They're real. And when the people of Linton speak, when they let their words out, they open the door." The younger man's face paled, and his eyes flicked nervously toward the window, as though the creatures might be listening, waiting. "And what happens when the door opens?" he asked, almost too quietly. The older man's voice dropped even lower, his words barely a whisper. "The creatures come. They come from the darkness, born from the people's fears, from their deepest, darkest fears. And when they come, they don't just take the words. They take everything." Sam's blood ran cold as he listened, his breath catching in his throat. He had heard rumors, whispers in the streets, but hearing it from someone like this, someone who clearly knew more than he was letting on, made the terror all too real. Creatures born from fear? It sounded like something out of a nightmare. But he knew that there was truth in those words. This was no simple superstition. This was something far darker. The younger man spoke again, his voice a strained whisper. "Then, how do we stop it? How do we break the curse?" The older man's face twisted into a grimace, and he shook his head. "You don't stop it. You can't. The curse is part of the town now. It's woven into the fabric of this place, like the air they breathe. There's no escaping it. Not unless you leave. And even then, there's no guarantee." Sam's chest tightened, and he felt his legs weaken beneath him. The door. The creatures. He had come to Linton seeking a story, but now he realized it was more than that. He wasn't just hunting for the truth. He had stumbled into something far worse. Something that couldn't be written into a story. It had to be lived. The younger man seemed to be struggling with the weight of it. But what happens when they don't speak? What happens to them? The older man was silent for a long time, staring into the dimly lit corner of the room. When he spoke, his voice was barely more than a hoarse breath. "They live in fear, in silence. But it's not the silence that kills them, it's the fear. They're trapped in it, trapped in a loop. And every time the creatures come, they take a little more of their souls, until there's nothing left." Sam's stomach churned. He had heard enough. He didn't need to hear any more. The curse, the creatures, the endless cycle of terror that had gripped this town for generations. He could feel it now, deep in his bones. The weight of it, the inevitability of it. He turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest, and he crept back to his room. The conversation lingered in his ears, the words echoing in his mind. And as he lay down on the bed, the sounds of the town, of Linton, seemed to close in on him. The silence wasn't just oppressive. It was suffocating. And as the fog pressed against the windows, Sam wondered if he, too, would become part of it. If the creatures would come for him, too, drawn by the words he had already spoken, by the thoughts he hadn't yet let go. Sam's footsteps echoed in the musty hallways of the old town library, the building so quiet it seemed to swallow up every sound he made. Dust motes floated in the air, caught in the slivers of sunlight that filtered through the grimy windows. The shelves, packed with yellowing books and brittle pages, seemed to hold secrets that had been left to rot for years. But Sam wasn't interested in books about history or the weather. He needed to find something that could explain what had happened to Linton, something that would answer the questions that gnawed at him. He paused in front of an old oak cabinet that stood in the corner of the room, its brass handles tarnished by time. His eyes scanned over the faded label on the cabinet door, Archives. Inside, Sam knew, would be the town's forgotten history, the parts people didn't want to talk about. The forbidden parts. The door creaked open, and Sam pulled out a stack of fragile papers and files. Most were legal documents, land deeds, tax records, nothing unusual. But one file, tucked at the very bottom, caught his attention. It was bound in leather, the pages inside yellowed and brittle with age. The cover had no title, no markings of any kind, just a simple lock clasped shut by a rusted metal clasp. His pulse quickened. This was it, the thing he had been looking for. He pulled it free and placed it on the table, the leather feeling cold beneath his fingertips. He tugged at the clasp, which released with a soft click, and opened the book. Inside, the first page bore a single name, Eliza Wells, and the dates of her life, long ago past. The handwriting was delicate, faded, but still legible. It was clear this journal had been written by someone who had witnessed the events that Sam was trying to unravel. The first few pages were mundane, detailing Eliza's daily life in Linton. Simple observations, notes on the weather, the crops. But then the entries began to change. The tone shifted from peaceful to frantic, the words growing more desperate as the days wore on. It was the entry dated September 14, 1892, that made Sam's stomach tighten. Today, the man came again. He speaks of things I don't understand. He has been to the town before, but this time he offers them a deal. He says that if we agree to silence, we will be spared. He promises that the horrors of the creatures will never touch us again. Silence, in exchange for our lives. But what of our souls? What of our voices? He says the curse will be lifted, but at a cost. The silence will be eternal. We will never speak again. Sam's throat went dry as he read the words. He flipped through the pages more quickly now, the journal's contents unraveling the true horror of the curse. The townspeople had made a deal with this man, this entity, and in doing so, they had sealed their fate. The silence wasn't just a punishment. It was a pact, a bargain to save them from something worse. October 3, 1892. The entity is here again. The people gathered in the square, and he spoke to them in hushed tones. The agreement was made. We will live in silence, yes, but there is a price to pay. Those who break the silence will summon the creatures, terrible creatures, things that are born from the deepest corners of fear. They will come for us, for them. And there is no escape. We will live in fear, trapped in our own silence, until the end of time. Sam's hands trembled as he turned the pages, his mind racing to piece it all together. The creatures, the silence, the deal. It was all coming into focus now. The curse had been born of desperation, an entire town willing to give up its voice to survive, to keep the horrors at bay. But that wasn't the end of it. No, the silence wasn't just a precaution. It was the only thing standing between the people of Linton and the monsters that had once ravaged the town. November 9, 1892. We spoke today. Just one word, just one sentence. But that was all it took. The creatures came, clawing from the darkness. They are real, and they are here. I saw one tonight, lurking at the edge of the woods. It is, as the stories say, a thing of shadows and teeth, its eyes burning with the fear it feeds on. The town is not safe. We are cursed. We can never speak again, for every word will bring them back. Sam could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end as he read the final entry. It was brief, as if Eliza had run out of time to write more, or had simply given up on words altogether. December 12, 1892. We have become mute. Our tongues are sealed. The creatures no longer come, but they are always there. Watching. Waiting. We live in silence now. A silence that carries the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. It is a curse we can never escape. The journal ended there, leaving Sam with a sinking feeling in his gut. It was worse than he had imagined. The town hadn't just been silenced by fear. They had sealed themselves in, choosing a lifetime of silence to stave off the monsters. The creatures didn't just appear when the silence was broken. They were always there, lurking in the dark corners of the world, feeding off the fear of anyone who dared to speak. Sam slammed the journal shut and leaned back in the chair, his heart hammering in his chest. The silence was more than just a quiet town. It was a prison built by fear, with walls made of silence and dread. He had come here looking for a story, but now he realized he was part of it. The creatures were real, and they were waiting. Sam hadn't slept well since arriving in Linton, but that night sleep came to him like a creeping fog, curling around him even before he closed his eyes. It was different this time. The oppressive silence in the town seemed to seep into his room, suffocating the air, pressing down on him. It was as if the walls themselves were listening. When he finally drifted off, the dreams began. They weren't like any dreams he had ever experienced. The shadows were deeper here, darker. There was no color, only the grayness of fog, the kind of fog that clung to your skin and seeped into your bones. Sam stood in the middle of the street, the empty town surrounding him. The air was thick with a strange heaviness, and in the distance a figure appeared, its form vague and indistinct. The figure didn't speak. It only raised one hand, its long fingers stretching towards him like a beckoning. Sam tried to move, but his feet were rooted to the ground. Panic began to creep up his spine, but he couldn't escape. He was stuck, frozen, as the figure came closer, its face still hidden in shadow. The sound of whispers filled the air, like 1,000 voices all speaking at once, but none of them made sense. Words tangled together in an endless loop, rising and falling in intensity. Sam felt the weight of the whispers pressing on his chest, making it harder to breathe. He opened his mouth to scream, but nothing came out. The whispers grew louder, louder still, until they became a roar. He could feel them, scratching at his mind, clawing at his thoughts. Then a voice, sharp and clear, cut through the noise. "Speak, speak, and they will come." Sam's eyes snapped open. His body was drenched in sweat, his heart hammering in his chest. The room around him was dark and still, just like it had been before. But something had changed. There was a pressure in the air, something heavy and unseen, as though something was waiting. He could feel the presence of it, the weight of it, pressing on him from all sides. He could hear the whispers now, not just in his dreams but in the silence of the room. Low and menacing, they curled around him, words he couldn't understand but could feel deep in his gut. It was like a slow-moving current, pulling him deeper into something he couldn't escape. Sam tried to shake it off, but as he turned over in the bed, his mind was still filled with those whispers, still reeling from the strange figure in his dream. He rubbed his face with his hands, trying to clear the fog in his mind, but it lingered, like a stain he couldn't wash away. And then it happened again. The whispers came. They weren't just in his dreams anymore. They were inside his head, inside his ears. Soft at first, just a murmur in the back of his thoughts. But then they grew louder, louder, until it was all he could hear, until it was all he could think. "Speak," the voice whispered, its tone low and coaxing, like a lover's promise. "Speak, and the creatures will come." Sam felt the air around him shift. The room grew colder, the silence heavier. The whispers turned into something else, shapes in the dark, figures moving just beyond the edge of his vision. Shadows flickered at the corners of his eyes, and he could almost see them. Tall, hunched figures, their faces distorted and grotesque. They were watching him, waiting for him. He tried to ignore them. He tried to push them away. But the words wouldn't stop. They rolled off his tongue before he could stop them, his lips moving against his will. He tried to bite them back, but it was as if they had a life of their own, pouring out of him like a river that couldn't be dammed. "I can't stop," Sam muttered, his voice barely a whisper in the darkness. But the words were there, crawling out of his mouth like insects, wriggling and twisting, just as the creatures did in his dreams. He hadn't meant to say it, but once it was out, it was too late. The room seemed to close in around him, the shadows growing thicker, more solid. Something shifted in the dark corners, something that wasn't quite human. He could feel the presence of it, the weight of it, pushing against the walls, pulling at the edges of his sanity. Sam tried to breathe, to calm himself, but it was impossible. The whispers were everywhere now, louder, more insistent, each one a threat, a promise of things to come. He could hear the creatures in the distance, their screeches tearing through the silence of the night. They were coming for him. "Speak, Sam," the voice urged again. "Say the words. Say them aloud, and they will come." He could feel the pressure building in his chest, the weight of the curse closing in on him, tightening like a noose. The whispers turned to screams, 1,000 voices crying out, demanding that he speak, that he release them from the darkness. Sam squeezed his eyes shut, covering his ears, trying to block them out. But it was no use. The sound of his own voice, his own cursed words, echoed in his head louder and louder, until it became deafening. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispers stopped. The room was silent again, save for the pounding of Sam's heart in his ears. He opened his eyes, gasping for air, his skin slick with sweat. The room was still dark, still suffocating, but the creatures were gone. For now. But Sam knew they weren't gone for long. The curse had found him, and it wouldn't stop until he was consumed by the darkness. The night was thick with silence. Sam lay in bed, staring up at the cracked ceiling of the old-in room, listening to the soft creaks and groans of the building. The wind rattled the window, a low, mournful sound that only added to the oppressive stillness that had settled over the town. It had been days since Sam first arrived in Linton, but the quiet had become unbearable. His thoughts were racing, tangled, disjointed. The whispers in his head were growing louder, demanding that he speak. But he fought it. He had to. He couldn't give in, not yet. Suddenly, the silence broke. At first, it was so subtle that Sam thought he might be imagining it. Soft, hesitant footsteps from outside, like someone moving carefully, trying not to make a sound. But these weren't the footsteps of any person he knew. They were too slow, too heavy, the thud of something large and unsteady, dragging itself along the ground. Sam's heart skipped a beat. He pushed himself up in bed, trying to steady his breath. Was it one of the townspeople? No, they never moved like that. They never ventured outside after dark. The footsteps came again, closer now, scraping along the street outside the window. Sam's fingers trembled as he reached for the curtain, pulling it aside just enough to peer through the crack. What he saw sent a jolt of cold terror straight to his core. In the alley, just beyond the reach of the streetlights, stood a figure. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its shape was twisted, like it had been bent and reshaped by something cruel. It loomed in the shadows, its silhouette a jagged line against the dark backdrop of the town. At first, Sam couldn't make out its features. The thing was obscured by the darkness, its form shifting and stretching like smoke. But then, the creature stepped into the faint glow of the streetlight, and Sam's breath caught in his throat. It had no face, not really. There were patches of skin that stretched across what might have been a head, but it was just wrong. The skin was pale and slick, stretched too thin over bones that didn't belong to any creature of this world. Its eyes were the worst part, glowing faintly with a sickly yellow light, like two coals smoldering in the dark. Sam could feel them, those eyes, boring into him, though he didn't move, didn't even dare to blink. The creature's gaze seemed to reach inside him, digging into his chest, twisting his heart with fear. He backed away from the window, his breath ragged, his pulse hammering in his ears. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, dragging along the cobblestone road. The creature was coming closer. It wasn't until the thing turned its head, no, not turned, twisted, that Sam realized just how far gone this town was. The creature's neck bent at a horrible angle, its spine cracking with the movement. It was like it didn't belong to the natural order of things. The entire being was a mistake, a mutation, an aberration. Sam stumbled back, nearly tripping over the chair beside the bed. His heart was a drum in his chest, and the whispers returned, louder now, clearer than ever. "Speak. Say it. Say the words and they'll come." No, Sam thought, shaking his head. He couldn't. He had to stay silent. He had to. But the creature outside the window wasn't waiting. It was moving now, its shadow stretching as it slid closer to the inn. Sam heard its breathing, a sound like wet, ragged gasps, as though it was struggling to catch its breath. The footsteps were almost deafening now, a constant relentless rhythm that matched the beating of his heart. It was here. Sam's mind raced. He couldn't escape. The curse had found him. The creature was drawn to him, to the sound of his voice. He had broken the silence once, and now there would be no going back. He backed away from the window, his hands trembling as he grabbed for the door. But before he could reach it, the sound of scraping metal froze him in place. Something was at the door, something trying to get in. The creature. Sam's body was frozen, caught between the desperate need to flee and the paralysis that gripped him. The whispers in his head were louder now, a cacophony of voices, urging him to speak, to say the words. They were inside him, pulling at him, twisting him. He could feel his lips moving, the words slipping out before he could stop them. But it wasn't the words that mattered. It was the sound of them, the sound of speaking, that brought the thing to him. He was too far gone to stop it now. The door rattled again, harder this time. The creature was trying to break through. Sam opened his mouth, but the only thing that came out was a strangled gasp. And then there was a knock. A single, slow knock on the door. It was followed by a voice, a low, growling whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Let me in." Sam felt the cold grip of terror wrap around his throat. He wanted to scream, but all that came out was a strangled sob. The creature was coming, and there was no escape. The streets of Linton were quieter than ever. Sam had spent the better part of the afternoon wandering through the town, desperate for answers. The whispers in his head had been growing louder with every passing hour, the voices beckoning him to speak, to break the silence that had gripped him. But Sam resisted. He knew now, more than ever, that speaking would bring the creatures, those twisted horrors that had haunted Linton for generations. As he walked, he saw the same faces over and over again, their expressions frozen, their eyes full of fear. They were all watching him, but no one spoke. They couldn't. They weren't allowed to. By the time dusk settled over the town, Sam had made up his mind. He would confront them, the townspeople. He had to know the truth. He had to find out how to break this curse, how to escape the horrors that were closing in on him. He made his way to the town square, where a small group of people had gathered. They were standing in a tight circle, their hands folded in front of them, their eyes downcast. There was a woman in the center of the group, her face wrinkled with age, her hands shaking as she gestured toward him. Sam stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to speak, to ask them what he needed to do. But the words caught in his throat, stuck like ash in his mouth. He looked around at the people, their eyes pleading, their hands trembling. They were waiting for him to ask the question they knew was coming. The woman spoke first, but it wasn't with her voice. She raised one hand slowly, her fingers twitching with effort, then pointed to her throat. She mimed cutting it, her face twisted in a grimace, and then she pointed to Sam, her gaze fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He didn't understand. The meaning was clear, but the words, he needed the words. Another man stepped forward, his face a mask of sorrow. He reached out and gently took Sam's hand, guiding it to his own throat. The gesture was unmistakable. The silence. The sacrifice. The words they couldn't speak, the truth they couldn't voice, were now clearer than ever. Sam's heart sank. He stepped back, shaking his head, disbelief washing over him. This is crazy, he thought. They can't be serious. But the woman's eyes didn't waver. She shook her head slowly, her hand still hovering near her throat. Then, as if to emphasize her point, she raised both arms and drew a circle in the air, a slow, deliberate motion. Sam stared at her, confusion and terror warring inside him. The woman's gestures were like a language born from years of silence. She wasn't just speaking with her hands. She was pleading, begging him to understand the gravity of what she was saying. Another woman, younger than the others, stepped forward. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She mimed speaking, but no sound came from her lips. She then pressed her hands to her chest and pointed to Sam. Then she made the same throat-cutting gesture that the first woman had made. The meaning was unmistakable now. To break the curse, Sam would have to give up his voice. He would have to become like them, silent, forever. Sam's mind raced. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, suffocating him. The creatures, those shadowy, grotesque beings, would come again. The townspeople had been paying the price for years, and now it was his turn. If he chose to speak, to break the silence, the creatures would be unleashed once more. They would ravage the town. They would tear everything apart, just as they had done before. But if he didn't speak, if he chose to remain silent, he would be just like them. The curse would never be lifted, and the creatures would be forever trapped in the silence, bound by the words they could never speak. The town would remain trapped in its endless nightmare, a nightmare Sam could never escape. He looked at the townspeople, their eyes filled with sorrow and desperation. They had made their choice long ago. They had sacrificed their voices, their humanity, to keep the creatures at bay. And now Sam was being asked to do the same. It was a simple choice, but one that would change everything. To speak or not to speak? The question echoed in his mind, like a poison, growing louder with every passing second. And then, as if guided by some unseen force, Sam opened his mouth. His lips trembled, his throat tight with fear, but the words were there, growing inside him, pushing to be released. He took a step forward, his hand trembling as it reached toward his throat, the urge to speak nearly overwhelming. But then something stopped him. In that moment the creatures seemed to stir, like a distant whisper in the darkness, a rumble of thunder on the horizon. Sam could feel it, deep in his bones. They were coming. His breath quickened, and his heart pounded in his chest. He knew that whatever decision he made, it would come with a cost. There was no escaping this curse, no escaping the silence. Sam's breath came in shallow gasps, his throat dry, his mind a whirlwind of dread and defiance. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, but the need to speak, no, to shout, had become unbearable. He stood at the center of the silent town, surrounded by the lifeless, expressionless faces of the townspeople. Their wide eyes locked onto him, but no one moved, no one spoke. For weeks he had lived in this unnatural silence, suffocating under the weight of it. The creatures had been the reason for it, the monsters that stalked the town in the darkness. And now Sam knew the truth. The silence was the only thing keeping them at bay. The townspeople had made a pact, sacrificed their voices, and the creatures would stay away. But that silence had broken something inside Sam. It had twisted him, had driven him to the edge. He couldn't stay silent any longer. The creatures were coming. Sam could feel it, like a shadow creeping up behind him, ready to pounce. But if he spoke, if he broke the silence, there would be no going back. He could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on him, and yet the words pushed against the walls of his throat, begging to be freed. He had to choose. To speak and face the consequences, or remain silent and let the creatures claim the town once again. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. The townspeople seemed frozen, their eyes locked on him, filled with something like fear, but also something else. A silent plea. Sam clenched his fists, his nails digging into the palms of his hands. He could hear the creatures in the distance, their terrible howls sending a chill down his spine. The ground beneath him trembled, a low rumble that felt like the pulse of the earth itself, warning him, warning them all. With a sharp intake of breath, Sam opened his mouth, his voice shaking as he shouted into the night. Enough! The word tore through the silence like a jagged bolt of lightning, the sound so loud it made the air crackle. The world seemed to pause for a moment. For one heartbeat, everything was still. Then the ground shook violently, and the town groaned under the weight of whatever ancient force had been disturbed. Sam staggered back, his heart racing. He had done it. He had spoken, and now there was no turning back. The earth trembled beneath him as cracks began to appear in the streets. The wind howled, carrying with it a foul, rancid stench. Sam's eyes widened as the cracks in the ground widened, revealing a darkness beneath, deeper than anything he could have imagined. From the shadows emerged the creatures, twisted, grotesque forms, their eyes glowing with an unholy light. Their bodies were made of shadow and flesh, shifting and contorting as if they were a living nightmare. The first of them lunged forward, its mouth gaping wide, revealing rows of sharp, glistening teeth. Sam didn't have time to react before it was upon him. He felt a cold, clammy hand grip his shoulder, its claws digging into his skin. He cried out, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of the creatures emerging from the depths. Sam fought to break free, his body trembling as the creatures surrounded him. They were all around him now, shadowy, grotesque figures that reached out with long, bony fingers, their claws scraping the earth like the sound of nails on a chalkboard. Their eyes glowed with an insatiable hunger, their mouths open wide, drooling with anticipation. Sam stumbled backwards, his heart racing, the fear overwhelming him. He had broken the silence, but he had not anticipated the sheer terror these creatures would bring. They were closing in on him now, their claws reaching out for him, their mouths gaping, ready to consume him whole. And then, in the midst of the chaos, Sam saw something that froze him to the core. The townspeople, silent, immobile, were watching him. They were not coming to his aid. They were watching, waiting, their eyes wide with something like horror. They knew. They had known all along that this would happen, that speaking would bring the creatures back. Sam's legs gave way beneath him, and he collapsed to the ground, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The creatures were drawing closer, and he could feel their cold, clammy hands reaching out for him, pulling him deeper into the darkness. But as they closed in, something shifted. The ground beneath him seemed to grow colder, darker, as if it were alive, feeding on the fear that radiated from Sam. The creatures hissed, their glowing eyes narrowing as they recoiled from the darkness that surrounded him. Sam looked up, his mind racing. He had broken the silence, but now there was a chance. A slim chance. The creatures were drawn to fear, to the very words that had summoned them. But perhaps silence would be his salvation now. With every ounce of strength he had left, Sam closed his eyes and did the only thing he could. He stopped speaking. The world around him grew still again. and the creatures paused, their forms flickering, wavering in the dim light. For a moment, it seemed as though the curse might be lifted. But then, with a sound like thunder, the creatures screamed, their twisted mouths wide open, and the earth shook once more. Sam had broken the silence, and now he would pay the price. The creatures were closing in, and the ground beneath Sam's feet seemed to pulse with a rhythmic, unnatural thud, as if the town itself was alive and breathing. He didn't dare look back. There was no time. The air felt heavier now, thick with the stench of decay, as if the very earth was rotting beneath him. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a drum of panic that echoed in his ears. The streets of Linton had once been calm, even idyllic. Well, at least from the outside. Now, they were a maze of collapsing buildings and crumbling roads. The windows of the old shops were shattered, the doors hanging off their hinges. The houses that had stood tall just days ago were now crooked shells, their foundations sinking into the blackened earth. The town was dying. The creatures were consuming it, one terrifying inch at a time. Sam ran, his breath ragged, his legs aching with the effort. Every step he took felt like it might be his last, the earth beneath him trembling as though it was trying to pull him under. He could hear them now, behind him, around him. Their screeches, guttural growls, and the sound of claws scraping against the asphalt echoed through the desolate streets. They were coming. He pushed himself harder, his boots pounding the pavement. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to escape this nightmare. His mind raced, trying to think of some avenue of escape, some crack in the world that he could slip through. But the truth was, he wasn't sure he could escape. Not anymore. The silence had been broken. The creatures had been freed. And no matter how fast he ran, no matter how far he went, he could feel them inching closer, their presence a weight on his chest. The curse had followed him, like a dark shadow, a persistent thing that refused to let go. It was a part of him now. He had broken the silence. He had let them in. And there was no going back. Sam's mind began to crack, the edges of his thoughts slipping, like loose threads unraveling. His lungs burned for air, his vision blurred by the heat of his panic. He had to get out. He had to get away. He turned a corner, hoping the alley would offer some refuge, but the street ahead of him was no better. The buildings were more shattered now, the windows dark and empty. He could hear the creatures moving just beyond the bend, their low growls vibrating the air. Sam turned to run again, but his legs betrayed him. They buckled beneath him, sending him crashing to the ground. His palms scraped the rough pavement as he pushed himself up, but it was too late. The first creature emerged from the shadows, a towering thing, its limbs long and twisted, its face a mass of shifting shadows. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, piercing through the dark like twin lanterns. Sam froze, his breath caught in his throat. His hands trembled at his sides. "Get up," he whispered to himself, though the words were barely a breath. He had to move. But something held him in place. The creature stepped closer, its claws clicking on the pavement like knives scraping against stone. Sam's skin crawled. He wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to get away from this nightmare, but the words were trapped inside him. The silence, the curse, it had claimed him. He could feel it tightening around his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. Suddenly, the ground shook again, and Sam stumbled. He looked up, his eyes wide with terror as more figures emerged from the shadows. Dozens of them. All of them hungry. All of them waiting. They weren't just creatures. They were the town's darkest fears made flesh. They had always been here, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, with the silence broken, they were free. The town was lost. Sam turned again, desperation fueling him as he stumbled back down the alley. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know if it even mattered. He just needed to get away. The alley seemed to stretch on forever, but every time he turned a corner, It felt like he was running in circles. The buildings loomed closer, their windows black and empty, as if the whole town had swallowed him whole. His chest tightened as he gasped for breath, the familiar dread settling into his bones. He could feel the curse, no, the town, dragging him deeper into its grip. There was no escape. Not for him. Not for anyone. He had broken the silence, and now the curse was his to bear. Sam's thoughts spiraled, his mind on the edge of madness. He could feel the creatures closing in, their claws scraping against the pavement, their breath hot on his skin. They were here, all around him, and he was trapped. The town was collapsing into chaos. The ground shook beneath him, cracks spreading across the streets like the spreading tendrils of some dark, ancient force. The buildings groaned, their walls buckling and crumbling as if they were made of paper. The town was falling apart, piece by piece, devoured by the creatures that had always been its true inhabitants. Sam stopped running, his body trembling as the truth settled in. There was no escape. The curse had consumed the town, and it had consumed him as well. He was a part of it now. The silence was a prison, and he had unlocked it. The creatures had been released, and they would never stop coming. He sank to his knees, the weight of it all crashing down on him. The town was lost, and so was he. The sun rose over Linton in the same way it always had. A pale, sickly light creeping across the deserted streets, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist as if they were alive. The town, though now seemingly empty, still carried with it a strange weight, a presence that Sam had come to understand all too well. It had been months since he'd spoken, months since the creatures had come for him. He hadn't meant to break the silence. He hadn't meant for the curse to return. But that moment of defiance, that brief instant where he had shouted out against the darkness, had sealed his fate. Now he was a part of Linton's legacy. The silence was his prison, just as it had been for those before him. The town felt different now. It had changed, or perhaps it had just grown older, more tired. But there was a certain emptiness to it now, a haunting stillness that seemed to seep into the very fabric of the place. The creatures had vanished, at least for now, but Sam knew they would return. They always did. The air felt heavy as Sam walked down the once bustling main street. His feet made no sound on the cracked pavement. The buildings loomed around him, their windows dark, their doors wide open like hollow mouths. He had become a part of the town, bound by the same curse that had gripped its people for generations. He couldn't speak any more. His throat felt raw, as if the very act of forming words had been torn from him. His voice, his life, had been sacrificed the moment he'd broken the silence. And now he was just like them, like the others who had come before him. Mute, helpless, trapped in a world of quiet terror. It was as if the town itself was watching him. He could feel the weight of its gaze, the pressure of the silence pressing in on him from all sides. The creatures had been banished for now, but they were never truly gone. They lingered in the shadows, waiting for the next soul to break the silence, waiting for the next person to speak. As Sam walked, his mind drifted back to the days before the curse had taken hold. He remembered the faces of the townspeople, their frozen expressions, their eyes wide with fear. They hadn't been able to speak, but in their silence they had told him everything he needed to know. The curse had a way of twisting everything, of making everything feel unreal. But Sam had understood. The creatures, the silence, it was all part of the same cycle, a cycle that would never end. The sound of footsteps echoed behind him. Sam turned, but no one was there. The streets were as empty as they always were. No one came here any more. No one ever would again. He had become a part of the town, a part of its tragic history, and that history would never let him go. He couldn't speak, but he could still feel the weight of the curse on him. It was in his bones, in his soul. It was the town's legacy, and now it was his too. As Sam walked past the old diner, he noticed movement in the window. At first, he thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him, but then he saw them. A family of 4, standing in the doorway, their eyes wide with confusion, their faces pale. They had come to Linton, unknowingly stepping into the trap. The cycle had begun again. Sam could see it in their eyes. They didn't know what they had walked into, didn't understand the danger that awaited them. But they would. They always did. The creatures would return. They would come, drawn by the breaking of the silence. And the family, just like Sam, would become part of the town's legacy. They would be trapped, unable to speak, unable to escape. Their voices would be lost to the curse, just as Sam's had been. And when the creatures came, when the nightmare began again, Sam would be there. He would be waiting, watching. He had become a part of the silence, a part of the town's cursed history, and he would remain here forever. The family stepped forward, their steps tentative, unaware of the terror that awaited them. Sam wanted to warn them, to shout at them to turn back, to flee before it was too late. But he couldn't. The silence had taken his voice. It had taken everything. And so he walked past them, his heart heavy with the knowledge that they were about to become part of the town's dark legacy. They were about to become like him, mute, trapped, and forever bound to the curse. The creatures were coming, and the silence would never be broken.